A man's flawless routine is interrupted by a girl offering a doll in exchange for food. By accepting, he has no idea that this act of kindness will lead to an unexpected transformation. What begins as charity turns into a deep bond that will change their lives forever. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. The clock read 6:42 in the morning when Richard Miller, 52, pushed open the glass door of the Sterling Cafe. The same time as always. The same corner table, the second one to the left of the entrance. The same order, a double espresso, buttered toast, and a glass of orange juice. No ice. No surprises. No deviations. Routine was his refuge. Every gesture calculated, every second accounted for. Richard had built an empire in the fine fabrics import business over 27 years of tireless work. He had started as an assistant in a small shop in the garment district and now ran Miller & Associates, one of the largest distributors of luxury textiles in the state of New York. His name was synonymous with excellence, punctuality, and rigor. People respected him, but few truly knew him. He preferred it that way. Alone since his divorce 8 years ago, Richard had learned to organize his life into compartments. Work from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., the gym 3 times a week, dinner, always at home, prepared by the cook who came twice a week and left everything ready. Weekends were dedicated to reviewing reports and planning the week ahead. There was no room for the unexpected. There was no need for company. On that Tuesday in March, the sky still carried the weight of the previous night's rain. The streets of downtown Manhattan were just beginning to stir. Richard finished his coffee with his usual precision, folded his napkin, adjusted the knot of his navy blue tie, and checked his watch. 6:58. Perfect. He would arrive at the office at 7:15, just like every other day. As he left the cafe, the cool morning air hit his face. Richard took a deep breath, savoring that brief moment before getting into his car. That's when he saw her. A small girl, no more than 4 years old, was standing on the sidewalk just a few feet from the entrance, barefoot. Her feet, caked with dust and dried mud, contrasted sharply with the impeccable cleanliness of the pavement, freshly washed by the rain. She wore a faded cotton dress, far too big for her frail body, and clutched something to her chest with both hands. Richard felt an immediate sense of unease. It wasn't common to see children alone in this area, especially so early. He looked around, searching for a responsible adult, but there was no one. The street was starting to fill with hurried workers and shopkeepers opening their doors, but no one seemed to notice the child. He hesitated. His instinct was to keep walking, get in his car, stick to his routine. But something in the little girl's eyes stopped him. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shouting. She just watched the people passing by with a serenity that was unsettling for someone so small. When their eyes met, the girl took a step forward. Her hands still squeezed the object against her chest. Richard could now see it was a doll, an old one, with tangled hair and clothes torn in several places. One of its arms was held on with brown packing tape. "Mister, do you want to buy her?" Her voice was thin, almost a whisper, but it carried a firmness that didn't match her apparent fragility. Richard frowned. "Buy what?" The girl held up the doll, presenting it carefully as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Lily, she's mine, but I can sell her." He felt a tightness in his chest. He wasn't prepared for this. "Where's your mother?" "At home. She's sick." The answer came without hesitation, without drama. "We need food. Mommy hasn't eaten in 3 days." The words hit Richard like a punch. He looked at the girl again. Her brown eyes were clear, limpid. There was no manipulation there, only truth. 3 days. He heard his own voice come out louder than he intended. The girl nodded. "She says she's not hungry, but I know she is," I heard her crying at night. "That's why I came to sell Lily." Richard felt something break inside him. The scene made no sense. A 4-year-old child, alone on the street, trying to sell a toy to feed her mother. Where was the rest of the family? Where were the neighbors? How had no one noticed? He crouched down to her level. "What's your name?" "Isabella, but Mommy calls me Bella." "Isabella, You can't be out here alone. Where do you live? Over there. She pointed to a narrow street that sloped down toward the old tenement buildings of the neighborhood. In the yellow house with the broken window. Richard glanced in the direction she indicated. He knew that area. Old buildings, some abandoned, others occupied by families who could barely make rent. And your father? I don't have a dad. The answer came without any weight, as if it were a simple fact of life. It's always been just me and Mommy. He pulled his wallet from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Isabella took a step back, startled, but he opened it slowly, taking out a few bills. $200. It was far more than what was needed, for food. Here, buy some food for you and your mum and keep your doll. But Isabella shook her head. I can't take it without giving you something. Mommy said we never ask for things for free. We have to trade. Richard felt a lump in his throat. This child, in the midst of such poverty, held on to a dignity that many adults had lost. He reached out, gently taking the doll. All right then, I'll take Lily. But you have to promise me something. What? That you'll go straight home and give this food to your mom. And that you'll eat too, promise? Isabella looked at the bills in Richard's hand. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She just nodded, carefully taking the money. Before running off, she touched the doll's hair one last time. Take good care of Lily, okay? She doesn't like to be alone. And then she ran, her bare feet slapping against the wet pavement, disappearing around the corner. Richard stood there, holding the old doll. Around him, the city continued its frantic pace. Cars honked, people rushed by, shops opened their doors. But he couldn't move. He looked at his watch. 7:12. He was late. For the first time in years, Richard Miller didn't care about his broken routine. He got into his car, placed the doll on the passenger seat, and drove to the office with a heavy heart. The entire way, he couldn't get the image of that barefoot girl out of his head, selling her only toy to feed her mother. When he arrived, his assistant, Megan, was surprised by his 3-minute delay. But she said nothing when she saw the expression on her boss's face. Richard locked himself in his office and placed the doll. It's on his mahogany desk. He stared at it for a long time. That old, patched-up, dirty doll seemed to be screaming something he couldn't name. Something about dignity, about love, about sacrifice. He tried to work. He reviewed contracts, took calls, approved orders. But his mind kept drifting back to Isabella. Where was she now? Had she made it home? Was her mother really sick, or was something more serious going on? At 11 o'clock, Richard made a decision. He picked up the phone and called Megan. Cancel my afternoon, I have an urgent appointment. He left the office without explanation, got in his car and drove back downtown. He needed to make sure that child was okay. He needed to know what was really happening. Parking near the cafe, Richard walked to the narrow street Isabella had pointed out. The yellow house with the broken window wasn't hard to find. It was the third in a row of old brownstones, with peeling paint and a rusty iron gate. He stopped in front of the gate. His hand touched the latch, but something stopped him from opening it. Was this trespassing? Was he crossing a line? What would he say? When the door opened, before he could decide, the door of the house creaked open, and there in the doorway stood a woman, too thin, too pale, with sunken eyes that carried years of exhaustion. Next to her was Isabella. The girl recognized him immediately, her eyes widening in surprise. "Mommy, it's the doll man!" The woman looked at Richard with a mixture of shame and suspicion. Her hands trembled slightly as she held onto the doorframe. "Sir, are you the one who gave my daughter money?" Richard nodded, not knowing what to say. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her strength. When she opened them again, tears were streaming down her face. "I didn't know she'd gone out. I swear I didn't. I would never send my daughter out on the street alone. I just can't anymore." Her voice broke. Her whole body trembled. And before Richard could react, the woman collapsed, her legs giving way, her body slumping to the ground. Isabella screamed. Richard managed to catch the woman before her head hit the concrete stoop. Her body was too light, as fragile as glass about to shatter. Isabella kept screaming, her small hands pulling at her mother's arm. "Mommy, Mommy, wake up!" "She's breathing." Richard tried to calm the girl as he adjusted the woman in his arms. "Isabella, help me. Open the door wider." The girl obeyed, running inside the house. Richard carried the woman in, his eyes scanning the room. The house was even smaller than he'd imagined. A tiny living room with an old, torn sofa, a plastic table with two mismatched chairs, and a kitchen that was more like a closet with a stove. In the back, a half-open door revealed a bedroom with a mattress on the floor. "There," Isabella pointed to the sofa. Richard laid the woman down gently. Her skin was cold, her lips pale. He placed a hand on her forehead. No fever, but her weakness was palpable. "Isabella, is there any water here?" The girl ran to the kitchen and came back with a plastic cup half full. Richard wet his fingers and dabbed her mother's forehead, then her lips. Slowly her eyes began to flutter open. "Easy. You fainted." Richard kept his voice firm but gentle. "When was the last time you ate?" The woman tried to sit up, but he stopped her with a gesture. She looked at Isabella, then at Richard, and shame washed over her face. Tears began to stream silently down her cheeks. I didn't want anyone to know. I swear I was trying to figure things out. I swear." "How long?" Richard repeated. 4 days. Her voice was a thread. "Isabella ate yesterday. The money you gave her. I saved half for tomorrow. She had rice and beans. But I couldn't. My stomach won't keep anything down anymore." Richard felt anger rising, not at her, but at the situation, at the silent injustice that happened every day in thousands of homes while the world went on indifferent. "What's your name?" "Julia. Julia Evans." "I'm 28. 28. The same age his own daughter would have been if the marriage hadn't ended, if life had taken a different turn. Richard pushed the thought away. "Julia, you're going to eat now, and then we're going to talk." "I can't accept anything else from you, sir. You've already done too much." "I'm not asking for permission." Richard stood up and went to the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator. It was empty, except for a half-empty bottle of water. The cabinets held only an open bag of rice and an expired jar of tomato sauce. He returned to the living room, took out his phone, and dialed a number. "Megan, I need you to do something urgent. Take down this address, 247 Orchard Street, the Yellow House. I want you to order a complete meal from Dom Giuseppe's, soup, main course, dessert, for 2 people, no, 3, and fresh juice. I want it here in 20 minutes, no more." Julia started to protest, but Richard held up a hand. "You are going to eat, your daughter is going to eat, and then we're going to talk about what happened." The woman closed her eyes, the tears continuing to fall. Isabella climbed onto the sofa and laid her head in her mother's lap, stroking her hair with a tenderness that broke Richard's heart. While they waited for the food, Richard sat in one of the plastic chairs. Julia, still lying on the sofa, began to talk. The words came out slowly, interspersed with long pauses. She had worked for 6 years as a custodian at a hospital. The pay was low, but it was enough to cover the rent and keep the bills paid. Isabella stayed with a neighbor during her night shifts. Life was hard, but it worked. 3 months ago, Julia started feeling sharp pains in her back. She ignored it for weeks, taking cheap painkillers from the pharmacy. When she finally sought help, the diagnosis was a herniated disc. She needed rest, physical therapy, proper treatment, but the hospital didn't have the resources to put employees on long-term leave. They gave her a week. She went back to work, still in pain. 2 weeks later, during a heavy cleaning job, something gave out. The pain was so intense she fainted in the hallway. She woke up in the emergency room of the very hospital where she worked. The doctor was blunt. If she kept pushing herself, she could suffer permanent damage. Julia was fired, without cause, without a proper severance package. Her severance pay barely covered the overdue bills. She looked for other jobs, but no one wanted to hire someone with a back problem. The interviews always ended the same way. "We'll review your resume and be in touch." They never were. The money ran out, the rent fell behind. The landlady, a 70-year-old woman, named Mrs. Celia, took pity on her and gave her another month, then another. But even patience has its limits. Last week she said she can't wait any longer. If I don't pay the 3 months of back rent by Friday, she'll have to evict me. She cried when she told me. I cried too. Julia wiped her face with the back of her hand. I tried to get help. I went to churches, to community health centers. I looked into social programs. But everything takes time. There are waiting lists. There's so much red tape, and in the meantime, my daughter is hungry. The doorbell rang. Richard answered it and took the bags from the delivery guy. The food was hot, the aroma filling the small room. He prepared a plate for Julia and another for Isabella. The little girl ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were her last. Julia tried to eat, but her stomach rejected it. She managed to sip the soup slowly, each spoonful an effort. Richard ate in silence, watching them. This scene should have been normal. A mother and daughter having lunch, but here in this cold, empty house it felt like a miracle. When they finished, he stood up. "Julia, do you know how to sew?" The question caught the woman by surprise. "Sew? Yes, my mother taught me. Why?" "Do you know how to do finishing work on fine fabrics, embroidery, alterations, that sort of thing?" "I do. I used to sew Isabella's clothes, did repairs for the neighbors. I never charged, but people said I was good at it." Richard nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "I import fabrics. I have a team of seamstresses who do special finishing work on pieces for specific clients. One of them just went on maternity leave. I need someone to cover for her for 3 months, maybe longer." Julia stared at him, not understanding. Are you offering me a job?" "I am. The work is Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Salary is competitive for the position, with transit and meal allowances. Can you start next week?" The woman was frozen. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Isabella jumped off the sofa and ran to Richard, hugging his legs. "Is it true? Is Mommy going to work?" "If she accepts," Richard looked at Julia, "and if she can take care of herself. You'll need to see a doctor. The company has a health plan. I'll make an appointment for you tomorrow." Julia began to sob, her whole body shaking. "I don't know what to say. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to thank me. You just have to show up on Monday, 9 o'clock sharp." Richard took a card from his pocket. "This is the address. If you have any problems before then, call me at this number." He placed 5 $100 bills on the table. "For you to pay part of. The rent and buy food until you start working. It's not a favor, it's a salary advance." Julia took the money with trembling hands. "I'll pay back every cent. I swear." "I know." Richard went to the door. Before leaving, he looked at Isabella. "Take care of your mom. And thank you for Lily. I'm taking good care of her." The girl smiled, and in that smile was a light Richard hadn't seen in years. He left the house and walked to his car. Once inside, he sat for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on nothing. What had he just done? He had offered a job on impulse, without checking references, without a formal interview, without following any of the protocols he himself had created at his company. His partners would question it. Megan would be confused. It was completely out of character. But when he thought of Isabella selling her doll on the street, when he thought of Julia starving so her daughter could eat, when he thought of that empty house, that silent loneliness, none of it mattered. Richard started the car and drove back to the office. On the way, he called Megan again. "I need you to draw up a temporary employment contract, starting next Monday. Position, finishing assistant, and make a doctor's appointment with Dr. Oliver for tomorrow at 10 a.m. It's urgent." Megan asked the usual questions, but Richard didn't give many details, just what was necessary. When he got back to the office, he went straight to his room and sat at his desk. The doll was still there, propped against the pencil holder. Richard picked it up and examined it closely. The clumsy stitches, the tangled hair, the torn dress. That doll represented everything Isabella had, and yet she had offered it in exchange for help for her mother. Richard felt something shift inside him, a crack in the wall he had built over the years, a space for something he had long since cast aside: compassion. He placed the doll back on the desk and returned to his work. But for the first time in years, work was no longer the only thing that mattered. That night, as he lay in bed, Richard couldn't sleep. He thought about Julia, about Isabella, about that cold house. He thought about what might have happened if he had simply walked away that morning. Some lives change in a matter of seconds: a chance encounter, an impulsive decision, a simple gesture. And as the city slept outside, Richard lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling, wondering what else that old doll would change in his life. Sunday passed like an eternity for Julia. She cleaned the house 3 times, washed the few clothes she owned, and tried to pick out what to wear on Monday. Nothing seemed right. Her dresses were old, faded, some with visible patches. Her pants had stains that wouldn't come out no matter how hard she scrubbed. Her shoes were worn, the sole of one starting to come loose. She sat on the bed and cried. How could she show up at a serious company dressed like this? People would look at her and know immediately where she came from. They would judge. They would whisper. Isabella came into the room and climbed onto the bed. "Mommy, why are you crying?" "It's nothing, sweetie. Mommy's just tired." "You're going to work tomorrow, right?" "The man said so." Julia hugged her daughter tightly. "I am, and everything's going to get better, you'll see." But as she said the words, fear tightened its grip on her chest. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she made mistakes? What if they found out she was there out of pity, not competence? On Monday, Julia woke up at 5 a.m. She showered, put on the best clothes she had, a pair of dark jeans and a simple white blouse, and tied her hair back in a bun. She left Isabella with Mrs. Celia, who had agreed to watch the girl during the day. The bus ride to the company took 40 minutes. Julia got off at the indicated stop and looked at the building in front of her. 5 stories of mirrored glass, a modern facade, a garden at the entrance. Well-dressed people walked in and out with briefcases and cell phones in hand. She took a deep breath and went inside. The receptionist looked her up and down before asking for her name. Julia noticed the glance, felt the judgment. She gave her name in a trembling voice. "Please wait over there." The young woman pointed to a row of chairs in the corner. Julia waited for 15 minutes until a middle-aged woman appeared. "Julia Evans?" "Yes, that's me. I'm Beatrice, supervisor of the finishing department. Follow me." Beatrice led her to the 3rd floor. The space was large, well lit, with work tables arranged in rows. There were about 15 women, all bent over colorful fabrics, needles and thread. The silence was broken only by the hum of sewing machines. "This will be your station." Beatrice pointed to a table in the corner. "You'll be working on finishing for high-fashion pieces, embroidery, appliques, fine adjustments. Mr. Miller said you have experience with sewing." "I do. I've been sewing since I was 12. Well, this is different from sewing at home. The clients are demanding. Every stitch has to be perfect. Any mistake could cost thousands of dollars." Beatrice looked her in the eye. "Do you understand the responsibility?" Julia nodded, her throat dry. "Good. I'll give you your first pieces. If you have any questions, just ask." The first few hours were calm. Julia focused on her work, her hands rediscovering their familiarity with the needle and thread. The fabric was fine, delicate, completely different from what she was used to. But her fingers remembered the movements, the necessary precision. At lunchtime, she went to the cafeteria. The other seamstresses were already there, sitting in small groups. Julia got her tray and looked for a place to sit. All the tables seemed full. She stood there, unsure of where to go. "You can sit here." A young woman with curly hair tied up in a bun motioned to the empty chair beside her. "Thank you." Julia sat down, relieved. "I'm Patricia. You're the new one." "I am. Julia." "Welcome." Patricia smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I heard you were hired directly by Mr. Miller." "I was." "Lucky you." The voice of another woman came from across the table. She was older, thin, with deep wrinkles around her mouth. "Most of us went through 3 interviews, a practical test, a probationary period. But you just walked right in." Julia felt the accusatory tone. I have experience with sewing. Of course, of course. The woman took a sip of her juice, her eyes fixed on Julia. We all do. The difference is, we had to prove it before we got in. The silence that followed was awkward. Julia looked down at her plate, her appetite gone. Patricia changed the subject, talking about a TV show, but Julia barely heard. Her mind was stuck on those words. Did everyone think that? That she was there because of favoritism? In the afternoon, Beatrice brought a special piece, a wedding dress, pearl white, with delicate lace appliques. It needed adjustments to the hem and embroidery on the sleeves. This piece is for a VIP client. The wedding is in 2 weeks, no room for error. Beatrice laid the dress on the table. Can you handle it? Julia looked at the fabric. It was beautiful, delicate, expensive. Her hands trembled slightly. I can. Good. I want it done by Thursday. Julia worked, with extra care. Every stitch had to be perfect, every movement calculated. But her mind was divided. Her colleagues' words echoed, the pressure mounted, and the more she thought about it, the more her hands shook. On Wednesday, while reviewing her work, she noticed the mistake. One of the embroidered sections was slightly crooked. Imperceptible to most people, but she knew Beatrice would spot it. She tried to undo it, to redo it. But the fabric was delicate. As she pulled the thread, a small tear formed, tiny, almost invisible, but it was there. Julia felt panic rise. She had ruined a dress worth thousands of dollars. She was going to be fired. She was going to lose everything all over again. She spent the entire night awake, trying to find a solution. On Thursday morning, she arrived at work with dark circles under her eyes. She took the dress to Beatrice, her hands shaking. I'm finished, but there was a small problem. Beatrice examined the dress with a clinical eye. She found the tear immediately. Her face hardened. How did this happen? I tried to redo some of the embroidery and the fabric tore. I'm so sorry. I can fix it. Fix it? Julia, this piece is worth $8,000. You can't just fix a tear in imported fabric. Beatrice threw the dress on the table. I'll have to send it to the specialist seamstress. It's going to cost another $500, and it's coming out of your paycheck. Julia felt tears well up but held them back. I understand. I'm sorry. I told you there was no room for error. Beatrice sighed. Look, I know you're new, but you need to be more careful. We don't work with cheap fabric here. This is expensive stuff for important people. The words felt like a slap. Julia just nodded and went back to her station. As she sat down, she heard the whispers of the other seamstresses. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Judgment, confirmation. She wasn't good enough. That afternoon, Richard appeared on the floor. Julia saw him talking to Beatrice, both of them looking in her direction. Her heart raced. Was he disappointed? Did he regret hiring her? Richard walked over to her table. Julia, can you come with me? She followed him to an empty conference room. He closed the door and looked at her seriously. Beatrice told me about the dress. I know, it was my mistake. I'll pay for it. You're not paying for anything. Richard held up a hand. It was an accident. It happens. You're learning. Julia looked at him, confused. But she said she was going to dock my pay. I gave orders not to. Mistakes are part of the process. He sat in a chair and motioned for her to sit as well. But I came here to talk about something else. I've noticed you're tense. Are the other seamstresses giving you a hard time? Julia hesitated. No, they're polite. Julia, she looked down. They think I'm here as a favor, that I don't deserve the job. Richard nodded slowly. And you? What do you think? The question caught her off guard. I don't know. Sometimes I think they're right. I got in without going through the normal steps. I haven't proven anything yet. You're wrong. Richard leaned forward. You're here because I saw you have skill. I saw it in the patches on your daughter's clothes, in the repairs you did for your neighbors. You have talent. The lack is confidence. Julia felt a lump in her throat. But what if I'm not good enough? What if I keep making mistakes? Then you'll learn from them. Nobody is born knowing, Julia. Everyone here has torn fabric, gotten a measurement wrong, been chewed out by Beatrice. He smiled slightly. The difference is they've forgotten that. They've gotten comfortable, and now they judge anyone who's just starting out. He stood up. I'm going to tell you something my father told me when I started in this business. Nobody changes their life without first feeling out of place in their new ones. You're going to feel like an outsider for a while. You're going to doubt yourself, but that passes. And when it does, you'll realize you deserve to be here just as much as anyone else. Julia let the tears fall. For the first time in weeks, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of relief. Thank you for everything. Richard nodded and left the room. Julia sat for a few minutes, taking deep breaths, trying to believe the words she had just heard. When she returned to her station, her colleagues looked at her with curiosity, but Julia didn't care. She picked up the next piece and started to work, focused, determined. The following days were easier. Julia made fewer mistakes, found her rhythm, and started talking more with Patricia, who turned out to be friendlier than the others. But the tension was still there in the way some of them looked at her, in the veiled comments in the cafeteria. On Friday, at the end of the day, Julia received her first paycheck, an envelope with her full salary. She opened it with trembling hands. $1,200, it felt like a fortune. On the way home, she stopped at the grocery store and bought real food. Rice, beans, chicken, fruit, vegetables. She filled 2 bags. When she got home, Isabella jumped for joy at the sight of all the food. "Mommy, look how much there is." "I know, sweetie. We're not going to be hungry anymore." That night, Julia cooked a full dinner for the first time in months. They ate together, sitting at the little plastic table, and for a few moments, everything finally seemed to be falling into place. But the following Monday, when Julia got to work, she found Isabella with a high fever. Mrs. Celia called in a panic. "Julia, the girl is burning up. You need to take her to a doctor now." Julia's heart sank. She had just arrived. She had just sat down at her station. If she left now, what would they say? That she was irresponsible, that she put her personal problems before her work. But it was her daughter, her Isabella. Julia ran to Beatrice, explaining the situation. The supervisor frowned. "You just got here." "I know, but my daughter has a high fever. I need to take her to the hospital." Beatrice sighed, clearly annoyed. "Fine, but you'll have to make up the hours later." Julia ran out, her heart pounding. She picked up Isabella from home. The girl was burning with fever, shivering. At the hospital, the wait was long, 3 hours before they were seen. The diagnosis was a virus. Nothing serious, but the girl needed rest and medication. Julia bought the medicine with the little money she had left and went home, exhausted. That night, as Isabella slept beside her, Julia stared at the dark ceiling and felt the fear return. What if she lost her job for missing work? What if Beatrice fired her? Everything would fall apart again. She closed her eyes, squeezing her daughter's small hand, and prayed that the next day would be different. But deep down, a voice whispered that maybe her luck was about to run out. The next morning, Julia woke up with her body heavy with exhaustion. Isabella was still asleep, her fever having broken during the night. She left the girl with Mrs. Celia again, along with instructions for the medicine, and left for work with a heavy heart. When she arrived at the company, the atmosphere was different. The seamstresses were talking, in small groups, casting glances in her direction. Julia felt her stomach churn. She went to her station and started working, trying to ignore the whispers. Beatrice showed up half an hour later. "Julia, I need to speak with you, in my office." The walk to the supervisor's office felt endless. Julia went in, her legs shaking. "Sit down." Beatrice closed the door and got straight to the point. "You left in the middle of your shift yesterday." "My daughter had a high fever." I explained, "I know and I understand you have a child, but this can't become a habit, Julia. The other employees have children too, and they manage to make arrangements." The words were like a punch. "I'm a single mother. I have no one to help me besides an elderly neighbor. And I'm sorry about that. But we have deadlines here, commitments. I can't make exceptions." Beatrice crossed her arms. "You left 3 pieces unfinished yesterday. I had to redistribute the work. The other women were overloaded." Julia felt tears welling up, but fought to hold them back. I'm sorry, it won't happen again. I hope not. Beatrice sighed. Look, I know Mr. Miller has a special fondness for you, but I need you to understand here, you're an employee just like everyone else. Same rules, same expectations. I can't treat you differently just because he brought you in. The sentence hung in the air. Julia understood the message between the lines perfectly. She was being watched more closely precisely because of that. Every mistake would be magnified. Every slip-up would be noted. I understand. Good, you can go back to work. Julia left the office feeling like she was walking a tightrope. One wrong step and everything would come crashing down. The following weeks were the hardest. Julia worked with intense focus, avoided long conversations, and ate lunch alone. Some of the seamstresses started to be friendlier, especially Patricia, who would invite her for coffee during breaks, but others kept their distance, their gazes cold, their comments sharp. One day during lunch, Julia overheard a conversation at the next table. She's only here because the boss felt sorry for her. I bet she can't even sew properly. I heard she was starving, selling things on the street. Poor thing, but that's no excuse to get in here without going through the normal process. Julia gripped her silverware tightly. She wanted to stand up, defend herself, scream that she was working hard, that she deserved to be there. But she swallowed her anger and continued eating in silence. Patricia, sitting next to her, touched her arm. Ignore them. They're bitter because they've never gotten anything more than what they have. But they're right. I got in differently. So what? You're here. You're working. That's what matters. Patricia smiled. You know what your problem is? You keep trying to prove you deserve to be here, but you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You just have to do your job. The words echoed in Julia's head. She really was trying to prove something all the time. Every stitch had to be perfect, every piece finished ahead of schedule, as if a single mistake would confirm everything the others thought. That evening, when she got home, she found Isabella drawing at the small living room table. The girl ran to hug her. Mommy, look what I made. It was a simple drawing, done with colored pencils. 2 figures holding hands, one big, one small. Above them a yellow sun. It's you and me, Mommy, happy. Julia felt her chest tighten. She hugged her daughter fiercely, breathing in the scent of her hair. We are happy, aren't we? We are, because now we eat every day, and you don't cry at night anymore. The innocence of those words broke Julia's heart. Isabella had noticed everything. The suffering, the silent tears, the fear, and yet she maintained that untarnished joy. Mommy's going to make everything work out, I promise. But the next morning when Julia arrived at work, she found a situation that would test that promise. Beatrice called her over as soon as she walked in. We have a serious problem. The client from the dress you damaged last month is complaining. She says the repair is visible. She wants her money back. Julia's blood ran cold. But you said the specialist seamstress was going to fix it. She did. But the client has a keen eye, she noticed. Beatrice looked at her sternly. Mr. Miller is dealing with it, but he wants to talk to you. Julia walked to Richard's office on shaky legs. She knocked on the door and entered when she heard him say to come in. Richard was on the phone, his face tense. He motioned for her to sit and wait. The call lasted another 5 minutes. When he hung up, he sighed deeply. The client is furious. She's threatening to sue the company. I'm so sorry, I didn't know that. Julia, calm down. I'm not blaming you. Richard stood up and walked to the window. I'm telling you because you need to know how serious this is. This kind of thing affects the company's reputation. VIP clients talk to each other. One complaint can cost us a lot of contracts. Julia felt the weight of his words. Is there anything I can do to help? No, it's being handled. I'm going to refund her money and give her a discount on her next order. He turned back to look at her. But I need you to understand. There's no room for mistakes like this here. I can't protect you from everything. I know, and I'm not asking for protection. I just want to work. Richard nodded. And you're working well. Beatrice showed me the last few pieces you finished. They're impeccable. The compliment took Julia by surprise. She said that. She did. Despite her criticisms, she recognizes you have talent. You just need more practice. Julia left the office with mixed feelings. Relief that she hadn't been fired, guilt for the problem she had caused, but also a flicker of pride. She was getting better. The weeks turned into months. Julia completed 3 months at the company and received the news she had been hoping for. Her contract was being made permanent. She was no longer temporary. She was a full-time employee with benefits. When Beatrice handed her the envelope with the news, Julia had to stop herself from crying right there. "Congratulations, you deserve it," Beatrice said, and for the first time there was sincerity in her voice. That afternoon, Julia left work with a heart lighter than it had been in months. She stopped at a bakery and bought a chocolate cake, Isabella's favorite. When she got home, the girl jumped for joy. "Cake? Is it someone's birthday?" "No, sweetie. It's just a celebration. Mommy has a real job now. Forever." Isabella didn't fully understand, but she sensed her mother's happiness. They ate cake together, laughing, making plans. Julia talked about buying new clothes, fixing the broken window, maybe even replacing the old mattress. "And can we buy paint? To paint the house?" Isabella asked, her eyes shining. "We sure can. What color do you want?" "Yellow, like the sun in my drawing." Julia hugged her daughter, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, real hope that things could finally get better. But life had other plans. 2 days later, Julia received a letter. Mrs. Celia, the landlady, needed to sell the house. Her son was having financial problems and was pressuring his mother to sell the property. Julia had 2 months to find another place. The news hit her like a bucket of cold water. Julia had just found stability at work, but now she would have to find another house, pay for a move, and deal with new expenses. She looked for places in the area, but the prices were far beyond what she could afford. Small apartments cost more than double her current rent. Houses in similar condition were in dangerous neighborhoods, far from her job. The sleepless nights returned. Julia crunched numbers, tried to find solutions, but the math never worked out. A week later, as she was leaving work, she ran into Richard in the parking lot. He was leaning against his car as if he were waiting for her. "Julia, can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course." "Beatrice told me you're looking for a new place. Trouble with the rent?" Julia hesitated. She didn't want to seem like she was asking for help again. "The owner needs to sell. I'm looking for another place." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I have a property, a studio apartment in a building near here. It became vacant last month. It's not big, but it's safe and clean. If you're interested, I can rent it to you for a price that fits your budget." Julia looked at him suspicious. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I need to rent the property and you need a place to live. It's a fair exchange. But you could definitely rent it for more to someone else." "I could, but I'd rather rent it to someone I know will take good care of the place." He took a key from his pocket. "Want to see the apartment before you decide?" Julia followed Richard to a building a 10-minute walk from the company. It was simple but well-maintained. The studio was on the 2nd floor, small but cozy. A combined living room and bedroom, a kitchenette and a bathroom. It even had a large window that let in plenty of light. "It's perfect," Julia whispered. "Then it's settled. You can move in whenever you're ready." Julia looked at Richard with tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you again. No need to thank me, it's business." But his smile said otherwise. That night, Julia told Isabella about the new apartment. The girl was excited about the idea of having their own room, even if it was small. "Can we paint it yellow?" "We sure can." "Sweetie!" 2 weeks later, they moved. They didn't have much. Clothes, a few kitchen utensils, the old mattress. But it was enough to start over. On their first day in the new apartment, Julia and Isabella sat on the floor of the empty living room, eating sandwiches. "Do you like our new home?" Julia asked. "I love it. It's tiny, but it's ours." Isabella smiled. "And it doesn't have a broken window." Julia laughed, hugging her daughter. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was building something solid. A steady job, a decent home, food on the table. But in the back of her mind, a question lingered. How long could she keep it all together? And what would she do if, once again, everything fell apart? The answer would come sooner than she imagined. 6 months had passed since Julia started working at Miller & Associates. A routine had been established. Wake up early, get Isabella ready for the public school she'd managed to enroll her in, work from 9 to 5, pick up her daughter, go home, have dinner, help with homework, sleep. Day after day, week after week. The studio apartment was still simple, but now it had new curtains, some furniture bought from thrift stores and pots that weren't dented. Isabella had received a gift from Richard for her 5th birthday, a new doll, similar to Lily, but whole, without any patches. The girl named her Luna and treated her with the same affection she had given Lily, but the old doll hadn't been forgotten. Julia knew Richard kept it somewhere, though she had never asked where. At work, Julia had earned respect. Not from everyone, but from many. Her sewing was precise, her deadlines were met. Beatrice was still tough, but fair, and Patricia had become a true friend, someone Julia could confide in during difficult times. But the stability she had sought for so long brought with it an unease Julia couldn't name. It was as if she were waiting for something bad to happen, as if happiness were temporary, a pause between one tragedy and the next. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday in September, everything began to change. Richard didn't show up for work. This was unusual, but not alarming. He traveled frequently to close deals, visiting suppliers in other cities. Megan, his assistant, just said he was handling personal matters. But on Wednesday, when he didn't show up either, the rumors started. "I heard he's sick." "No, he had a family emergency." "I bet it's a woman. Rich men always have a mistress." Julia ignored the gossip and kept working. But on Thursday, Megan appeared on the seamstress's floor, her face pale. She called Beatrice for a private conversation. When the supervisor returned, her eyes were red. "Ladies, I have something to announce. Mr. Miller was in an accident. He's in the hospital." Silence fell over the room. Julia felt her heart pound. "What kind of accident?" someone asked. "A car accident. He was coming back from a meeting in Stamford when a truck swerved into his lane. His driver managed to avoid a direct hit, but they crashed into the guardrail. Mr. Miller hit his head and injured his spine." Julia brought a hand to her mouth. His spine, just like she had injured hers. She knew how much that hurt, how it limited you, how it destroyed plans. "Is he okay?" Patricia asked. "He's alive, but he'll need surgery. And after that, a lot of rest." Beatrice took a deep breath. "The company will continue to operate as usual. The partners will take over management temporarily, but I wanted you all to know." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Julia tried to work, but her hands were shaking. She thought of Richard, always so serious, so in control, now lying in a hospital bed. At the end of the day, she found Megan. "Which hospital is he in?" "St. Mark's Hospital." "But I don't think they're allowing visitors, Julia." "I know. I just wanted to know." Julia went home, prepared dinner mechanically, and helped Isabella with her homework. But her mind was far away. She thought about the cruel irony of the situation. Richard had given her a chance when she was at rock bottom, and now he was the one who needed help. On Saturday morning, Julia took a bus to St. Mark's Hospital. She didn't know if she would be able to see him, but she had to try. At the reception desk, she explained that she was one of his employees. The attendant checked a list and shook her head. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Miller is not receiving visitors. Family only." "I understand. Could I at least leave a note?" The woman hesitated, then handed her a piece of paper. Julia wrote a few words. "I'm rooting for your recovery. If you need anything, just call. Julia." She left the note and walked out of the hospital with a heavy heart. The following weeks were strange. The company was running, but without Richard's presence, everything felt different. The partners, 2 men in their 60s, rarely came down to the seamstress's floor. Beatrice handled everything alone, and the pressure on her was reflected in the team. Deadlines became tighter, demands higher. Important clients started complaining about delivery delays. 2 seamstresses quit, overloading those who remained. Julia worked overtime without complaining. She would get home exhausted, barely able to play with Isabella. The girl noticed. "Mommy, you're tired again, just like before." I'm just a little tired, sweetie. It'll pass. But it didn't pass. The pressure only grew. A month after the accident, Megan came with news. Richard had been released from the hospital, but had returned home in a wheelchair. The surgery was successful, but the recovery would be long. Months of physical therapy, rest, and constant care. Julia felt a tightness in her chest, imagining that man, so independent, so in control, needing help for everything. That night, as she was tucking Isabella in, the girl asked about the doll man. "Is he sick, Mummy?" "He's getting better, sweetie." "Could we visit him? Bring him a drawing? You said drawings make people happy." Julia smiled, moved by her daughter's kindness. "That's a great idea. Let's do that." The following Sunday, Julia called the number Richard had given her months ago, the emergency contact. It was Megan who answered. "Julia, how are you?" "Hi, Megan. Sorry to bother you on a weekend. I was wondering if it would be possible to visit Mr. Miller. My daughter made a drawing for him." There was a pause. "Hold on a moment." Julia heard muffled voices in the background. Then Megan came back. "He said you can come over. This afternoon, if you'd like." Julia's heart raced. "Really? Thank you." She wrote down the address, an apartment in an upscale Manhattan neighborhood, and got Isabella ready. The girl put on her best dress and held the drawing carefully. The building was imposing, with a 24-hour doorman and a mirrored elevator. Julia felt out of place in that environment, but Isabella was too excited to notice. Megan greeted them at the apartment door. The place was huge, decorated with dark wood furniture and paintings on the walls, but there was something lonely about the space. "He's in the living room. You can go in." Julia held Isabella's hand, and they entered. Richard was sitting in a wheelchair near the window, looking out at the city. When he heard them, he turned. Julia was shocked to see him. He had lost weight, had dark circles under his eyes, and needed a shave. His always erect posture was now slumped. Julia, Isabella. He tried to smile, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Hi, doll man." Isabella let go of her mother's hand and ran to him, holding out the drawing. "I made this for you to get better." Richard took the paper carefully. It was a drawing of a person standing up, with arms outstretched, surrounded by colorful flowers. At the top, written in crooked letters, "Get well soon." "It's beautiful." "Thank you, Isabella." His voice came out hoarse. The girl smiled and went to explore the living room, touching objects with childlike curiosity. Julia approached him. "How are you?" "Surviving." Richard placed the drawing in his lap. "The doctors say I'll walk again, but it's going to take time, months, maybe a year. A year goes by fast," he laughed humorlessly. "Not for the one who's waiting." Julia sat on the sofa next to him. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you have anyone taking care of you? Family, friends?" Richard looked out the window. "I have a nurse who comes 3 times a week, a cook who leaves food ready. Megan stops by to handle work matters. But family? No. My parents have passed away. I don't have any siblings, and my marriage ended years ago." The loneliness in those words was palpable. Julia knew that feeling, of being surrounded by things but empty of people. "I could help." The words came out before she could think. "Not with medical things, but, I don't know, keep you company, cook a meal, help with whatever you need." Richard looked at her, surprised. "Julia, you already work all day. You have a daughter to take care of. You don't need to overwork yourself." "It's not overworking. It's paying it forward." Julia held his gaze. "You helped me when I had nothing, when I was alone and desperate. Let me help you now." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. He just looked at her, and Julia saw something break in his eyes. The armor of the successful man, always in control, cracked. I accept." And so began a new phase in their relationship. Julia started visiting Richard 3 times a week after work. She brought Isabella with her, and the girl lit up the apartment with her presence. She chattered non-stop, showed him her drawings, and told him stories from school. Julia cooked simple meals, helped Richard move around the house when the nurse wasn't. there and read to him when she saw he was bored. Slowly he began to open up. He talked about the marriage that ended because he prioritized work too much, about the loneliness he had chosen as a shield after the divorce, about the fear of never walking again, of losing everything he had built. Julia listened without judgment. Sometimes she offered words of comfort. Other times she just sat there, in silence, and that was enough. One day, while helping him move to the physical therapy chair, Julia noticed the doll. Lily was on a shelf next to books and picture frames. "You kept her." Richard smiled. "I did. She reminds me of something important." "What's that?" "That sometimes we need help, and that accepting help isn't a weakness." Julia felt her eyes well up. "You taught me the same thing." Richard's recovery was slow and painful. There were good days when he could stand with help for a few minutes, and there were bad days when the pain was so great he could barely move. Julia was there for both. On the good days, celebrating every small victory. On the bad days, offering silent support. But while she was taking care of Richard, Julia didn't realize that her own life was about to fall apart again. At the company, the partners began to implement changes. They wanted to cut costs, increase productivity. There was talk of layoffs, of benefit cuts. Beatrice gathered the team on a Friday afternoon. "Ladies, you know Mr. Miller is on leave. The partners are re-evaluating the entire company structure. There will be changes. I don't know yet what this means for us, but be prepared." Julia left work with a weight on her chest. Would she be laid off? Losing her job, now after everything, would be devastating. That night, when she visited Richard, she was too quiet. He noticed. What happened? Julia told him about the meeting, about the changes, about her fear of losing everything. Richard frowned. "I didn't know they were planning this. I'm going to call—" "No," Julia interrupted him. "You need to recover. You can't stress about this right now." "But it's my company, and you'll go back to it. But first, you need to get well." Julia touched his hand. "I'll be fine, I always am." But she wasn't sure about that, and when she got home that night, she found an envelope under her door, an eviction notice. The building's owner, who had bought the property from Richard months ago without her knowledge, wanted to renovate and sell. Julia had 30 days to leave. She sat on the living room floor, the paper trembling in her hands, and for the first time in months she let the tears fall freely. Isabella came out of her room, frightened. "Mommy!" Julia quickly wiped her face, trying to hide her despair. But the girl saw. And in that moment, Julia understood that no matter how hard she fought, how much she tried, life would always find a way to push her back to the edge. Julia spent the weekend in a state of shock. The eviction notice sat on the kitchen table, a constant reminder that stability was just an illusion. She tried to hide the situation from Isabella, but the girl could tell something was wrong. "Mommy, are we going to have to move?" Julia forced a smile. "Maybe, sweetie. But we'll find another nice place. Can it be a yellow house again?" Julia's heart broke. It can. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. With the salary she earned, she could barely afford another apartment at the current market rates, and if she were laid off, as she feared, she wouldn't be able to pay rent at all. On Monday, when she arrived at work, the atmosphere was heavy. Beatrice called all the seamstresses into a meeting. "The partners have made a decision. We're reducing the team by 30%. The layoffs will be announced by the end of the week." Panic filled the room. Who would be let go? What were the criteria? Beatrice didn't give any more details, just asked everyone to continue working as usual. But how could anyone work normally knowing that at any moment they could be called in to get the news? Julia tried to concentrate, but every time she saw Beatrice approaching, her heart pounded. The days passed in a silent agony. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. With every employee called into the supervisor's office, the rest held their breath, waiting. On Thursday afternoon, it was Patricia's turn. Her friend went into the office with a pale face and came out 10 minutes later with red eyes, clutching a letter. "They let me go," she told Julia, her voice trembling. "They said, they need to cut costs and I'm one of the newest hires." Julia hugged her friend. feeling the injustice burn in her chest. Patricia had 2 young children and an unemployed husband. Losing her job would be devastating. And if Patricia, who was competent and dedicated, was laid off, what chance did Julia have? On Friday morning, Beatrice finally called her in. Julia walked into the office, her legs shaking. She sat in the chair, her hands sweating. "Julia, you know why you're here." "I do," Beatrice sighed. "The partners have decided that you are part of the group being let go. Your performance is good, but you're still one of the most recent hires. And with Mr. Miller on leave, there's no one to defend your position." The words fell like stones. Julia felt the floor disappear from under her feet. "When?" "The end of the month. You'll receive your full severance package, of course, and we can provide a letter of recommendation." Julia nodded mechanically. She couldn't process the information. It was as if she were watching the scene from outside her own body. "I'm very sorry, Julia, truly." Beatrice held out the termination letter. Julia took the paper, stood up and left the office. She went back to her station and packed her things into a small box. She didn't have much, just scissors, thread, a few patterns. The other seamstresses watched her in silence, grateful it wasn't them. She walked out of the company without looking back. On the bus ride home, Julia stared out the window, the city a blur. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? 6 months ago, for the first time in her life, she had a stable job, a home, hope. And now she was back where she started. No job, no home, no future. When she got home, she found Isabella drawing in the living room. The girl looked up at her and knew immediately. "What happened, Mommy?" Julia tried to lie, to say everything was fine, but she couldn't. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. Isabella dropped her pencil and ran to hug her. "Don't cry, Mommy, please don't cry." "I'm sorry, sweetie. Mommy's just a little sad." "Is it because of work?" Julia nodded, unable to speak. Isabella hugged her tighter. "We're going to be okay. You always say that. We're always okay." But this time Julia wasn't. So sure. She didn't tell Richard. In her visits over the next few days, she pretended everything was normal. He was making progress in physical therapy, able to take a few steps with support. He was upbeat, hopeful. Julia didn't want to take that away from him. But Richard noticed. He always noticed. "Julia, what's wrong?" "Nothing. I'm just tired." "Don't lie to me." He looked at her with an intensity that made any lie crumble. "What happened?" Julia took a deep breath and told him. The layoff, the eviction, the fear that she wouldn't be able to get back, up this time. Richard was silent for a long moment. Then, in a controlled voice, he said, "I'm calling the partners right now. I'm going to make them rehire you." "No." "What do you mean, no?" "Julia, I need to learn to solve my own problems." Julia wiped away her tears. "You're not always going to be there to save me, Richard, and I can't depend on that. I need to find my own way." "But you have a daughter. This is no time for pride." "It's not pride. It's dignity." Julia stood up. "I'll find another job. I'll find another place to live. I'll manage, like I always have." Richard wanted to argue, but he saw the determination in her eyes and fell silent. Julia spent the next week looking for a job. She handed out resumes at stores, restaurants, other sewing companies. But the answer was always the same. "We'll review it and be in touch." They never were. She also looked for apartments, but the prices were impossible. The few she could afford were in dangerous neighborhoods, far from Isabella's school, far from everything. The eviction deadline was approaching. Julia had saved a little money, but it wouldn't be enough for the first month's rent and security deposit on a new place. One night, sitting on her bed, watching Isabella sleep beside her, Julia wondered if she had made the right choice. Should she have accepted Richard's help? Was her stubbornness putting her daughter at risk? The next day, when she visited Richard, he had a proposal. "Julia, I know you don't want my help, but just listen." He was sitting in his wheelchair, but there was something different about his posture, firmer. "I need someone to take care of me during the day. The nurse can't be here full-time, and I need help with basic tasks. Could you do it?" Julia frowned. "Are you offering me a job?" "I am, as a caregiver. Part-time, from 9 to 3. I'd pay you the same as you were making at the company. You'd have the afternoons free to be with Isabella or look for another job. Richard, before you refuse, think about it. You need money. I need help. It's not a favor. It's a fair agreement between two people who trust each other. Julia wanted to refuse. She wanted to prove she could do it, on her own. But she looked at the reality. The eviction deadline was in a week. She had no other job. She had nowhere to go. "And a place to live?" she asked, her voice low. "The apartment here has 2 bedrooms. I never use one of them. You and Isabella can stay there. No cost. Consider it part of your salary if you prefer to think of it that way." That's too much, Richard." "It's not. It's fair." He leaned forward. "Julia, you've already helped me. Over the last few weeks, your presence has done more for my recovery than any physical therapy. Let me return the favor. Not out of pity, but out of friendship." The word hung in the air. Friendship. Was that what they had? Julia thought of all the moments they had shared, the conversations, the mutual care. Yes, it was friendship. And maybe something deeper she didn't want to name. "I accept." The words came out before she could reconsider. "But on one condition." "What's that?" "If at any point you feel this isn't working, that I'm being a burden, you tell me, no holding back. Deal?" Julia held out her hand. Richard shook it, and in that touch something shifted between them. 3 days later, Julia and Isabella moved into Richard's apartment. The girl was amazed by the space, the view from the window, the room that would be just for them. "Mommy, this is the biggest room I've ever had." Julia smiled despite the knot in her stomach. She was entering uncharted territory, living with a man she barely knew, depending on him in a way she had sworn she never would again. But when she saw Isabella laughing, jumping on the new bed, looking out the window at the city, below she felt that maybe, just maybe, she had made the right decision. That first night, after putting Isabella to bed, Julia went to the living room. Richard was there, looking out the window. "Thank you," she said simply. He turned, and in the dim light of the room his eyes looked different, softer. "Thank you for accepting." They stood in silence for a moment, a comfortable silence, filled with mutual understanding. "You know," Richard said eventually, "when I met you that morning, I thought I was helping you, but I think I was the one who needed help." Julia didn't know what to say. She just nodded, feeling something settle in her chest. Life began to reorganize itself. Julia would wake up early, make breakfast for the 3 of them, take Isabella to school, come back and take care of Richard. She helped with his physical therapy at home, prepared meals, kept him company. In the afternoon, she would pick up Isabella, help with homework, and play with her. It was a different routine, but it worked. And slowly, that apartment began to feel less like the place where she worked and more like home. But Julia didn't let herself think about it too much, because deep down she knew it was temporary. Richard would recover, he would walk again, he would go back to his company. And when that happened, he wouldn't need her anymore, and she would have to start over. Again. What Julia didn't know was that the biggest test was yet to come. One night, 3 weeks after they moved in, Richard's phone rang. It was one of his partners. Julia only heard his side of the conversation, but it was enough to understand. The company was in crisis. A major client had cancelled a huge contract. The partners wanted to sell. Richard hung up the phone, his face pale. "What is it?" Julia asked. He looked at her, and in his eyes was something she had never seen before. Fear. "They want to sell the company, and if they do, everything I've built over the last 27 years will be gone." The news about the sale of the company left Richard in a state Julia had never seen. He barely slept that night, spending hours on the phone with lawyers, accountants, and the partners themselves. Julia heard snippets of the conversations, trying to grasp the scale of the problem. Miller and Associates was on the brink of financial collapse. The major client who had cancelled the contract accounted for 40% of their revenue. Without that income, the company couldn't meet its obligations. The partners, Men in their late 60s wanted to sell while there was still value, but Richard refused. "That company is my life," he told Julia the next morning, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "My father started that company. I turned it into what it is today. I can't let it be sold off and dismantled. What can you do?" "I need to go back. Take control again. Find new clients, restructure, save what can still be saved." He looked at his wheelchair with anger. "But how am I supposed to do that stuck in this damn chair?" "You're making progress. The physical therapist said it will take months." "I don't have months, Julia. I have weeks, a month at most, before the partners sign the papers." The frustration in his voice was palpable. Julia sat down beside him. "Then we speed things up. You do physical therapy twice a day instead of once. I'll help you with the exercises. And in the meantime, you can work from here. Video meetings, phone calls, whatever you need." Richard looked at her with a mix of gratitude and despair. "Even if I can walk again, I don't know if it will be enough. The damage is already done." But Julia wouldn't accept defeat. In the following days, she intensified her support. She woke up earlier to do physical therapy exercises with him. She helped organize documents, make calls, schedule meetings. In the afternoon, after picking up Isabella, she would rush back to continue helping. Richard worked tirelessly. Even from his wheelchair, he called old clients, negotiated new contracts, and tried to turn the situation around. Julia saw how much it exhausted him, but she also saw the determination returning to his eyes. Isabella, always a perceptive child, noticed the tension. One night at dinner, she asked, "Is Mr. Richard going to lose his company?" Richard looked at the girl, surprised by her frankness. "I'm trying to stop that from happening. You'll do it. My mom says that when you don't give up, things get better." He smiled, but it was a tired smile. "Your mother is very wise." "She is. She's the strongest person I know." Julia felt her eyes well up. She quickly got up to get dessert, hiding her emotion. 2 weeks later, Richard received news that changed everything. An international client, a chain of high-fashion stores in Argentina, was interested in a major contract. But they wanted an in-person meeting in Buenos Aires in 10 days. "I can't travel in this condition," Richard said, frustrated. "I can't sit on a plane for hours. I can't show up to an important meeting in a wheelchair." "Why not?" Julia asked. "You're in a wheelchair, not a coma. Your mind is working perfectly. So is your ability to negotiate. They'll look at me and see weakness. In the business world, appearances matter. Then show them you're strong despite the chair. Or better yet, because of it." Julia moved closer. "You went through a serious accident and you're still fighting to save your company. That's not weakness, Richard. That's strength." He looked at her for a long moment. "Do you really believe that?" "I do." Richard ran his fingers through his hair, thinking, "Even if I go, I can't go alone. I need someone with me. Someone who knows the company, who can help me with the presentation, with the documents." "What about Megan?" "Megan is great, but she needs to stay here and manage what's left. I need someone who—" He paused, looking at Julia. "Would you go with me?" Julia blinked, surprised. "Me? But I don't know anything about business. You know about people, and you know the products. You worked with them for months. You can help me present the pieces, explain the manufacturing process." He took her hand. "I trust you, Julia." Julia's heart raced. Travel to another country. She had never even left New York, let alone the United States. But she saw the urgency in Richard's eyes, how much this meant to him. "What about Isabella? She can come with us. We'll only be there for 3 days. It'll be an adventure for her." Julia took a deep breath. "All right then, let's go." The next few days were a whirlwind, getting passports for her and Isabella, preparing documents, putting together the presentation. Richard taught Julia about the company's numbers, the specifics of the fabrics, how to present the products. Julia absorbed everything like a sponge. She took notes, repeated information, studied late into the night. She wanted to be prepared. She didn't want to let Richard down. Isabella was excited about the trip. "Are we going on an airplane, Mommy? A real one?" "We sure are, sweetie." "And I'm going to see another country?" Julia smiled, trying to hide her nervousness. "You are." On the day of the flight, Julia was so nervous she could barely eat. At the airport, she helped Richard with the wheelchair, the luggage, everything. Isabella held her mother's hand tightly, her eyes wide at the sight of so many people. The flight was smooth, but Julia couldn't relax. She kept thinking about the meeting, about what could go wrong, about how her inexperience could ruin everything. When they arrived in Buenos Aires, they went straight to the hotel, an elegant place, with spacious rooms and a view of the city. Isabella was thrilled, running from one side to the other, touching everything. "Mommy, look, there's a bathtub." Julia smiled, but her mind was on the next day's meeting. That night, after putting Isabella to bed, Julia went to Richard's room. He was reviewing the documents for the 1,000th time. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "Terrified," he admitted. "If this meeting doesn't go well, I lose everything." "You won't lose. You know what you're doing." "What if it's not enough? What if they look at me and just see a broken man?" Julia sat beside him. "You're not broken, Richard. You're injured. There's a difference. Injuries heal, and you are healing." He looked at her with an intensity that made Julia's heart race. "How can you believe in me so much?" "Because you believed in me when I had nothing, when I was just a desperate woman selling her daughter's doll on the street. You saw me, really saw me. Now it's my turn to see you." Richard took her hand and held it tightly. "Julia, I need to tell you something." But before he could continue, the phone rang. It was one of the Argentine clients, confirming the meeting. The moment was lost. The next morning, Julia wore the best clothes she had, a pair of black slacks and a simple white blouse that Richard had insisted on buying for her the day before. He wore a suit and tie, was clean-shaven, his hair neat. He looked like the successful businessman again, despite the wheelchair. The meeting was in a sleek office in the city center. 5 Argentine executives awaited them, middle-aged men and women, all impeccably dressed. Julia felt the weight of their stares as they entered. They saw the wheelchair. They saw Richard's hesitation as he positioned himself at the table. But then he began to speak. His voice was firm. He presented the company, the products, what made them unique. Julia supported him, showing fabric samples, explaining the manufacturing process with a passion that surprised even herself. The meeting lasted 3 hours. There were tough questions, tense negotiations, but Richard didn't waver. He argued, he negotiated, he presented concrete numbers. In the end, the lead executive, a gray-haired man named Mr. Dominguez, stood up. "Mr. Miller, I'll be frank. When we heard about your accident, we were concerned. But I see our concern was unfounded. Your determination, even in your current circumstances, is admirable." Richard gripped the arm of his chair tightly. So we have a deal. We'll sign the contract." Julia had to stop herself from shouting with joy. Richard shook everyone's hands, maintaining his professional composure. But she saw the relief in his eyes. When they left the office and were back on the sidewalk, Richard finally let the mask fall. "We did it, my God, we did it." Julia hugged the wheelchair, hugging him. "You did it." "We did it," he corrected, looking at her with a genuine smile. "I couldn't have done this without you." They returned to the hotel in celebration. They told Isabella, who jumped for joy even without fully understanding what it meant. They had dinner at an Argentine restaurant, eating grilled steak and sweet dessert. It was one of the happiest nights Julia could remember. But the happiness was short-lived. On the flight back to the US, Richard started to feel sharp pains in his back. He tried to hide it, but Julia noticed. "Are you okay?" "Just tired from the trip." But when they landed in New York, he could barely move. The pain was so intense, they had to call an ambulance at the airport. At the hospital, the diagnosis was clear. Richard had pushed himself too hard during the trip. There was severe inflammation in his spine. He would need another surgery, more rest. The doctor was direct. "Mr. Miller, your body is telling you to rest. If you keep forcing it, you could have permanent damage. Do you understand? Permanent." Richard stared at the ceiling of the hospital room, defeated. After everything, after managing to save his company, his own body was betraying him. Julia stood by his bed, holding his hand. "It's going to be okay." But he shook his head. "No, it's not. I got the contract, but I won't be able to execute it. The partners will have to take over, and they'll mess it all up. They'll sell as soon as they can. Then we won't let them." "How?" His voice was bitter. I'm going to be stuck in this bed. For weeks. Maybe months. Julia was silent, thinking. Then, with a firm voice she didn't know she had, she said, I'll run the company for you. Richard looked at her as if she had gone crazy. What? You've taught me everything over the last few weeks. I know the products, I know the clients, I can be your eyes and ears there. Make the small decisions, report the big ones to you. The partners won't sell if they see someone is keeping things running. Julia, you have no management experience. This is insane. More insane than a woman with nothing, selling her daughter's doll on the street. More insane than that same woman being hired without an interview. More insane than us living together, traveling together, saving a company together. She squeezed his hand. Trust me, like I trusted you. Richard looked at her for a long moment, and then slowly he nodded. All right, let's try. But neither of them knew that Julia's decision to take on this challenge would have consequences that would change their lives forever, and that the greatest test of their relationship was still to come. Julia walked into Miller & Associates the following Monday with a mix of determination and dread. Beatrice greeted her with surprise. Julia, I thought you were laid off. I was, but now I'm back, representing Mr. Miller. She handed her a letter signed by him, authorizing her to make decisions in his name. He's recovering from another surgery and needs someone to keep things running until he returns. Beatrice read the letter, incredulous. Are you serious? Completely. The news spread quickly. The seamstresses whispered. The partners called an emergency meeting. Julia faced them with the same firmness she had seen Richard display. Mr. Miller secured a major contract with the Argentine company. The company has a future, he just needs time to recover. The partners, practical and weary men, hesitated. But the Argentine contract was real, and it represented a financial lifeline. They agreed to give him more time, but they made it clear, if the situation didn't improve in 3 months, they would sell regardless. The first few days were the hardest of Julia's life. She knew nothing about management, about numbers, about business decisions. She called Richard every hour, asking about everything. He guided her from the hospital, patient, confident. You can do this, Julia. You just have to believe. But it wasn't just about believing. It was about facing people who underestimated her, suppliers who doubted her, employees who questioned her every decision. Julia heard the comments in the hallways. It's the former custodian playing manager now. Poor thing. Thinks she can be the boss just because she's sleeping with him. The words hurt, but Julia swallowed the pain and carried on. She worked 12, 14 hours a day. She studied reports at night after Isabella was asleep. She woke up early to review orders before heading to the company. Beatrice, surprisingly, became an ally. You're stubborn. I like that. She taught Julia about processes, how to handle difficult clients, about the details that made a difference. 2 weeks later, Richard was discharged. He came home still weak, but better. Julia continued to split her time. Mornings at the company, afternoons taking care of him and Isabella. One night, as they were reviewing reports together, Richard said, "You're doing an incredible job. Better than I expected. I'm learning. Making a lot of mistakes too. Mistakes are part of it. The important thing is you didn't give up." He paused. "Julia, I need to tell you something I've been putting off." She looked up from the paper. "What?" "When I met you that morning, I thought I was doing a good deed, giving a handout to a desperate mother, but I was wrong. You didn't need a handout. You needed a chance, and by giving you that chance, you gave me something back." "What did I give you?" "Purpose, connection. You showed me that life isn't just about work and control, that there are more important things." He took her hand. "And I fell in love with you in the process." Julia felt her heart stop. "Richard, I know it's complicated. I know you might think it's gratitude or that I'm confusing things, but it's not. It's love. Real. True." Tears streamed down Julia's face. "I love you too. But I'm scared." "Of what?" That when you're fully recovered, when you go back to your normal life, you'll realize this was all just circumstantial. Two wounded people leaning on each other. And what if it's not? What if it's exactly what it seems? Two people who found each other at the right time in the right way. Julia wanted to believe him, but the fear was stronger. In the following weeks, the company began to stabilize. The Argentine contract was being executed successfully. New, smaller clients appeared. The numbers improved. Richard was making progress in his recovery. He could walk with support a few steps each day. The physical therapy was showing results. But then, in the middle of a seemingly normal morning, everything fell apart. Julia was at the company when she received a phone call from a woman. "Hello, is this Julia Evans?" "Yes, who's calling?" "This is Claire Miller, Richard's ex-wife." Julia's blood ran cold. "How can I help you?" "I heard you're living with my ex-husband and working for him. I think we need to talk." They met at an elegant coffee shop. Claire was a beautiful woman in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed. She looked at Julia with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "So, you're Richard's savior?" "I don't see myself that way." "He does. He called me last week, asking for the final divorce papers, said he wanted to start a new life." Claire took a sip of her coffee. "I found that curious. We've been separated for 8 years and he never asked for them. Then you show up and suddenly he's in a hurry." Julia didn't know what to say. "I didn't know he had called you." "Of course you didn't. Richard was always private. But I'm here to give you some advice. Don't fool yourself. You were convenient. A needy woman he could save, who made him feel important. When the novelty wears off, he'll discard you just like he discarded me." The words were like knives. Julia tried to maintain her composure. "I think only Richard can speak for himself." "Perhaps, but I've known him for 20 years. I know how he operates. Work always comes first." "People are disposable." Claire stood up. "I'm just warning you so you don't get hurt." Julia returned to the company, shaken. Claire's words echoed in her mind. What if she was right? What if Julia was just a convenience, a woman who appeared at the right time when he was vulnerable? That night she came home quiet. Richard noticed immediately. "What happened?" Julia told him about the meeting, about Claire's words, about her own doubts. Richard turned pale. "She has no right to speak for me." "But she's known you for 20 years. I've known you for less than a year. How can I be sure this is real?" "Because it is. Julia, I called Claire to finalize the divorce because I want to be free to have a future with you, a real one, not as boss and employee, not as people sharing an apartment for convenience, but as partners. And what if you recover and realize you don't need me anymore? I will always need you, not because you help me, but because you complete me in a way no one ever has." Julia wanted to believe him, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The following week was tense. Julia kept working, caring, functioning, but there was a distance between her and Richard that hadn't been there before. Isabella, perceptive as always, asked, "Mummy, did you have a fight with Mr. Richard?" "No, sweetie, we're just tired." But it wasn't fatigue, it was fear. Fear of believing in something too good to be true. On Saturday, Richard asked to speak with Julia. He was standing, leaning on a cane, but standing. "I walked on my own today, 15 steps without help." "That's wonderful," Julia smiled, genuinely happy. "And it means I'll soon be able to go back to the company. Take control again, go back to my normal life." Julia's heart sank. This was it. The moment she had been dreading, when he wouldn't need her anymore. "I understand, and I'm happy for you." "Julia, you're not understanding." Richard picked something up from the table. It was the doll. "Lily, do you know why I've kept this all these months?" She shook her head, not understanding. "Because Isabella taught me something that day. She sold the most precious thing she had to save you, not out of obligation, out of love, and when you offered to help me, when you agreed to take care of me, work with me, fight for the company with me, you did the same thing. You gave the most precious thing you had, your time, your energy, your faith. He held the doll out to her. "I want to give Lily back to you. Not because I don't need her anymore, but because now she represents something different. She's no longer a symbol of need. She's a symbol of choice. I choose to be with you, not for convenience, for love." Julia took the doll with trembling hands. "Richard, marry me. For real. Be my partner in life, in the company, in everything. Not because you need me or I need you, but because we choose this." Julia looked at the old, patched-up doll. Lily, who had started it all. She remembered the morning Isabella had sold her, the desperation of that moment, how everything had changed since then. "Yes," the word came out in a whisper. "Yes, I'll marry you." Richard pulled her into a hug, and there, holding the doll between them, Julia finally allowed herself to believe. 2 months later, Miller and Associates was fully recovered. Richard was back at work, but now with Julia as an official partner. The old partners had retired, selling their shares to them. Julia continued to work with the seamstresses, but now she also made strategic decisions. Beatrice became the production manager. Patricia was rehired. On their wedding day, a simple but emotional ceremony, Isabella was the flower girl. She wore a white dress she had helped pick out herself, and in her hand she carried 2 dolls, Luna, the new one, and Lily, the old one. "They're both coming with me," she said, determined, "because they're both important." During the ceremony, Richard looked at Julia and whispered, "Thank you for saving me." "You saved me first." "No, we saved each other, together." And it was true. That chance encounter on an ordinary morning, a little girl selling a doll, a man offering help, had turned into something bigger. A family, a new beginning. A story that proved that sometimes the greatest gifts come at the most unlikely moments. Julia looked at Isabella, at Richard, at all the people gathered there. She thought about the journey, the suffering, the doubts, the fears, but she also thought about the courage, the persistence, the choice to keep going even when it seemed impossible. Because in the end, it wasn't the doll that changed their lives. It was the people, the choices, the commitment to not give up on each other. And when Julia placed Lily on a special shelf in the new home they shared, next to their wedding photos, she finally understood. Some stories don't come into your life to be solved. They come to rearrange you from the inside, to show you that deserving happiness isn't about the absence of pain, but the courage to keep going even when you're afraid. The doll remained there, a silent witness. No longer a symbol of fragility but of strength, no longer a reminder of need but of choice, because that old, patched-up, imperfect doll was proof that the most beautiful new beginnings are born from the most sincere acts of giving. And that true love isn't about saving or being saved. It's about walking together, even when the road is hard. It's about choosing, every single day, to truly be a part of each other's story. Julia learned that generosity isn't about offering what you have to spare, but about sharing your life. Richard learned that strength isn't about never falling, but about accepting a hand to help you get back up. And Isabella, the little girl who once sold her doll for love, learned that the simplest gestures can change entire destinies, because some transformations don't happen in grand acts. They happen in small choices made with truth, and the greatest of all was the choice to believe that, despite everything, they deserved to be happy. Together. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Julia, Richard, and Isabella has touched your heart. If you were moved by Julia's courage in fighting for her daughter and for the dignity of the family she built, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what part of this story resonated with you the most. Every day, we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul, showing that true wealth lies in the bonds we build, in the courage to accept help, and in the generosity to pay it forward when it's our turn to lend a hand. We'll see you in the next episode with another narrative that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on the values that truly matter in life.